So there is a fine, I think, a balance to be struck between, here again, optical quality and optical quantity. And I will generally try to reel people back from the big magnification is going to help me see better and try to get them into a better optic. That is what actually helps you see better, size aside.
What is up, everybody? I have my good friend Ryan Muckenhirn across from me right now, and we are covering a optics topic today. Optics topics, common misconceptions, and maybe some myths, regarding optics. I got my sheet of questions here, Ryan, that I mined from the team downstairs. I sent an email, and like 30 seconds later, they're like, this. And it's just stuff that gets asked a lot, which are good questions, right? That means it's a good question. A lot of people need to answer that question. And then some of the stuff, though, is perpetuated by people who quotation mark know. Like, it's like, I mean, you might read it in an article somewhere or something. You're like, well, not exactly. Yeah. So here we are. We're going to dispel some of these things, hopefully, to the best of our ability. That's why you're here. And we'll go from there. You got some good ones? I've got some good ones.
I've got one that fits a lot of different... I got one shoe that fits a lot of feet.
Is that like a start, or is that a finale? It sounds like a good one.
It could be either.
Okay. Let's go in hot, out of the gate.
You want to just...
Let's set the hook.
All right. You just want me to fire that bad chicken?
Yeah.
All right. And I don't want to get too long-winded on this because it applies to every optical system that we offer. And by that I mean, I shouldn't say every, but like categorically applies to rifle scopes, spotting scopes, and binoculars.
Okay.
Yes. And it's not a myth, it's a misconception. And that is, here's a broad stroke of the brush. Bigger is better.
Pretty loose.
I said broad. Broad stroke of the brush.
Now you've made me grab my pen. Explain.
Okay.
And I might debate.
All right. So by this, I'm talking both magnification, range, and then physical features. So when we're talking about magnification range, let's look at a rifle scope, for instance. A magnification range would be 3 to 9, a 4 to 12, a 4 to 16, a 6 to 24, a 5 to 25, 4.5 to 27, 6 to 36. Or in binoculars, 8 by 42, 10 by 42, 10 by 50, 12 by 50, so on and so forth. Same suit for spotting scopes. And then by physical features, I'm talking almost specifically objective diameter and also tube diameter.
Okay.
I see, and I have inquiry on a daily basis from folks looking for an optic of either large magnification, range, or value, and with these large physical attributes, thinking that they are, in fact, better.
Which they might be, depending on the application.
And I'm going to pull one out of one of our optical engineers' back pockets here. It depends.
Yeah, 100%.
It does. But I would say that modesty in selection will often yield, at least in my experience, the best results.
Okay. So I'm going to go into one of these things that you mentioned, because I feel like this is just one that I hear a lot. And again, I've read it in magazine articles about optics, right? A larger tube diameter to let in more light.
Right.
Which is not what's happening.
Correct.
Now, a large tube diameter can be important.
Absolutely.
It can be very important.
Yes.
For increasing, you've got a larger diameter tube, you've got more room for the internal erector tube to move up, down. You might get more elevation adjustment because of that, and that's great if you want to dial for long-range precision shots.
Yes.
We'll say. What happens, I think, sometimes, though, is a person gets the wrong scope because they say, well, I hunt in low-light conditions. So they buy this scope with the large tube diameter, that might have way more magnification than they need, that might not even fit on their rifle that well because maybe they have some lightweight sporting rifle, but I need this big tube diameter. Now you've got the entirely wrong optic.
Correct.
And you're not even getting what you wanted.
No.
Potentially.
Possibly going backwards.
Oh, boy.
Yes. So, so excellent spot. This is one I hear a ton. Big tube means brighter. Big tube means, as Mark stated, more room internally for mechanical adjustment, up, down, left, right, or more field of view, or a combination of both. And that's pretty much it. Now, there's some other nuances about optics that could be attacked here, but those are the big two takeaways from tube diameter. Adjustment range, field of view, one or the other, or a combination of both. Mm-hmm. So when we're designing and building optics, we're taking this into consideration. And let's pick on, say, our Razor HD Gen 3 6-36. Tons of adjustment range. The design intent of that rifle scope was long range, precision shooting. We also needed to marry a gratuitous field of view, especially for the competitor, law enforcement agent, or military user. We need a big field of view there. It has a large main tube. It accommodates both of those things wonderfully. But you don't see a 3-9 by 40 with a 34 millimeter tube in our line either. Because
no.
The two don't marry up very well. It doesn't make a lot of sense because tube diameter is not giving us more light, and intuitively we're not shooting 3-9 to a mile and a half.
Is tube diameter giving you more field of view, though?
Field of view, room for adjustment, or a combination of both.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, I learned things. Speaking of field of view, I'm going to switch gears to binoculars.
Oh.
One thing I hear is like, get the 10 by 50, or let's say 10 by 50 versus a 10 by 42, because I want that bigger field of view.
This is a very interesting one because you see that larger lens on a thing you put right up to your face to look far away, and you would think that larger lens is capturing a wider image. It makes
sense when you look at it.
It absolutely does. Generally speaking, it is the inverse. As we go wider in the lens, we actually restrict the field of view. There are a few extraordinarily rare exceptions to that, but generally, a 42 millimeter binocular will yield a wider field of view than a 50, and a 32 wider than a 42. That's wild.
It is wild. Now, I would say, let me ask this question.
Yeah.
It's generally not that much either way, though.
It's not huge.
I didn't ask a question. I made a statement.
Yeah. While you're finishing that statement, I'm gonna provide some adept examples. This will be the part where you keep talking.
I was gonna say I think we're doing fine, but I wish we would have grabbed also
some notes in the catalog.
Notes, catalog, and Mike McDowell.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He's all pro when it comes to this stuff.
But binoculars, the objective diameter thing is one that on a probably daily basis will hear that specific thing. I'm seeking the larger objective because I want the wider field of view.
I mean, I've seen in a couple instances where it really is like it's like a moot point between the two.
Correct.
Like we're talking like a couple feet at 1,000 yards.
Yep.
I don't know about you, but at 1,000 yards, I can't discern if something is 1 foot less or more,
Typically not.
Even if it's more than that, it's just
there's a 5-foot
undiscernible for me
between the Razor HD UHD 1042 and the 1050.
And which one has more field of view?
42.
Okay,
but 5 measly feet.
Right, at 1,000 yards.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that a wider objective does afford you in like optical systems, and that is a brighter image. We're allowing more light to come into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that does hold true, in rifle scopes, or if we had examples of this in a spotting scope. Like if we made an optic that was, say, a 20 to 60 by 60 and a 20 to 60 by 80, the 80 would be a more brilliant spotting scope than the 60 would be at same magnification in a low light scenario. Same thing with rifle scopes. So in our Crossfire 2 line, we have a 3 to 9 by 40 and a 3 to 9 by 50. We would, and you should also expect that 3 to 9 by 50 to be ever so slightly brighter in low light.
Can you explain, and I think it's, attached to this in some capacity, but we talk about exit pupil, like we're talking about, so the result of that wider objective, we'll say in like a 10 by 50 binocular versus a 10 by 42 binocular, all things being equal, you're letting in more light. You're doing the math equation of essentially you're dividing that objective diameter of 50 millimeters by the number 10, which is the power. You're getting 5. You have a 5 millimeter exit pupil.
Bingo.
Right? It doesn't necessarily work the same in rifle scopes, though.
No.
Can you explain how it's working in a rifle scope?
Not without the mathematical formula in front of me.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's not the same.
It's not the same.
Correct.
And I guess I feel like that's a common misconception, though, that
the translation is just
right.
Yeah. Another thing with binoculars too, and concessions that I'll see folks consider, is in favor of that larger objective. They want that lower light. A lot of times I'll see folks, and this is kind of where my bigger is not always better argument comes into play here. I'll see folks yield to the larger objective diameter, but then go down in optical quality if say an optical system doesn't have it. And then we're actually going backwards twice.
Sure.
Yeah. So exit pupil, which Mark talked about, is a decent baseline of understanding of what a binocular is capable of, but it doesn't tell the whole thing. It's just a figure on paper. And to pick on a couple, like if we were to take the exit pupil measurements from a 12 by 50 Crossfire HD, which represents the entry side of our line, and compare that to the exit pupil figure of a 12 by 50 Razor UHD, we'd actually find the same exit pupil.
Sure.
We'd have dramatically different optics.
Oh, 100%.
And by that we're talking about lens quality, coating qualities, prism quality, and then what you get as a user at the end of this is like image quality, right? When you're looking through it, how bright, how brilliant, how sharp, how clear, how clean is that image? So exit pupil alone does not necessarily dictate that you have a more brilliant solution.
No.
And actually that was kind of a backwards way to look at this. So like, let me give another example here, a better example, as we'll call it. If you looked at the exit pupil figure on an 842 Crossfire HD and compared it to a 1250 UHD, you would see the exit pupil figure on the Crossfire HD being considerably better, right? However, the optics on board the UHD are so exceptional that despite it having a smaller exit pupil in every other category, aside from probably linear field of view, you're exceeding the performance of the Crossfire handily, and you actually end up with a better, brighter, sharper image, even though you have a disparity in exit pupil. So there's a balance to be struck, and a thing that I will preach is optical quality first, then start pursuing optical quantity and feature set.
If you need it.
Correct. Yeah. So optical quality is a very, very important thing, because if you can't see what you're looking at, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I brought up Mike McDowell a little bit earlier. We did a podcast. I think it was like everything you need to know about binoculars, or everything you want to know about binoculars. Great podcast. And actually, I should go back and listen to it, because I remember one thing, and I can't remember exactly what it was. But we're talking about all these, numerical things. And then Mike was saying however, magnification, if you do increase magnification, I think that can essentially increase, don't quote me, but I want to say it was like resolution.
Was he talking about Twilight Factor?
Twilight Factor, yeah.
That's some spooky territory.
So then, obviously you can tell from right now, like even when he talked about that, I'm like, Mike just kind of twisted my mind up a little bit.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things at play there. But one thing, kind of across the board that we hear is larger objective binocular, wider field of view.
Yep.
Most of the time,
it's
not the case.
Myth busted.
And also most of the time, the difference is inconsequential. I got one for you. I got an air gun.
Oh, yeah.
I'm putting a scope on an air rifle. I need a special air rifle scope.
Right.
What's going on there?
This is speculation based on testing that we've done here and reports from the field. This is one I hear, again, very commonly. And I think if we were to look at air guns 25 years ago, and maybe even a little before that, when like the, quote, Magnum Springer or spring piston guns, started really getting good,
Mm-hmm.
the rings and optics provided with them were generally not. We see some goofy base solutions that are out there. A lot of times like an 11 or a 13 millimeter dovetail or a 3/8 inch dovetail. Very, very like small gripping surfaces on the tops of these rifles to affix a ring with.
Okay.
And then not a lot of really good rings on the market in that category. And if we take a rifle scope and we mismount it on pretty much any caliber, we can expect disaster. If we start having a scope migrating in the rings, or if we lose tension on the rings, or if we have some unusual torsion or bind, these are still a lot of, even from really good airgun companies, some of the rings that I've seen coming with them still have like the friction tape on the inside of the ring.
Ooh.
And I actually think it's probably more a factor of like the mounting solutions offered either with or available, these systems that do more harm than good. Modern rifle scopes seem to handle them just fine so long as they're mounted correctly.
Mm-hmm.
The same considerations that we would use or have for mounting a rifle scope on your 270, we should have for your airgun. Just like tires are the sole points of contact between you and the road and your vehicle, don't put retreads on a race car because bad things can happen when we are cornering. So, you know, we've got some 22 and 25 caliber spring piston guns here that we've tested with, and some real humdingers too.
Because oftentimes people say, well, the recoil impulse
Sure.
is different,
Yeah.
and therefore, you know, I think, you know, I need my lenses seated, you know, to be able to handle that.
Yeah. The same logic could be applied if I were to take a rifle scope and mount it backwards on a rifle. Would my expectation be that the rifle scope immediately fail under the duress of that recoil? Because I would be effectively replicating the, quote, reverse recoil, right? Short answer is no, not really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So good rings, very important.
This flows right into, so the answer is no, just buy the scope that you want. Now, this flows into my next one, which another one you hear, but I got a rimfire.
Mm.
Same story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reminded of the ball peen hammer story.
Which is?
There's a gentleman who was hunting ground squirrels. He stated that the recoil impulse of the 22 is effectively like a ball peen hammer. And that was significant. And that was the conclusion that I could draw from that conversation. The optic performed flawlessly. We mounted it up on a number of different centerfire solutions and it shot wonderful little groups. Here again, I think this is probably related to ring style, mounting practice, torque solution, that would cause a rifle scope to either meet an early death or probably just misbehave first and foremost. But the rimfire thing eludes me.
I agree.
Yeah.
Now, I'll say this, though, and I'd say I could see where a person might find confusion because they look at, you know, even our lineup, they go, but you guys sell a rimfire option.
Sure. Oh, is that what you meant?
No, it's not what I
okay.
meant. But
I see
could,
what you're saying.
No, not at all what I meant. But I could see, like, if a person had heard, well, yeah, that recoil impulse is different with a rimfire. You need a special rimfire scope. Oh, you look at the Vortex lineup. Yep, they make a rimfire model.
Yeah.
That's what that's for, which it is.
Yep.
It is, but not for that reason.
Right. And that reason, with respect to the rimfire models that we offer, is just a parallax setting.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of it being a fixed 100-yard parallax, it's a 50-yard parallax. We're looking at it, and they're two pretty specific scopes. They're not like a competition or target optic. They're more like a small game hunting or recreational shooting optic.
Mm-hmm.
2-7 variable powered, crossfire and diamondback. We set the parallax at 50 because intuitively we're thinking the shooter's probably going to be working in shorter distances, shooting something like a 22 long rifle. Mechanically speaking, they're no different than their non-rimfire counterparts. They just have a parallax amendment that's been done to them. You could just as well mount that rimfire optic on a centerfire rifle. And we have customers do that, especially those that are hunting in like heavily brushed areas where their shot opportunity might be 25, 35, maybe 50 yards. That's a wonderful compromise to make. Okay, well, here's an optic that is optimized for that distance of engagement. It happens to say rimfire in its name, but that designation is solely in our line anyway, for parallax setting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that, though, I'll say I've shot a number of critters inside of 100 yards, sometimes well inside of 100 yards with an optic that's either set at 100-yard parallax or has an adjustable parallax. They've all tipped over just fine.
Yeah.
Man, I'm shooting a Magnum, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm shooting a big gun here. I need to torque those rings. I don't want this scope to move.
Yep.
What would you suggest as an inch-pounds recommendation?
15 to 18 inch-pounds.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Well,
I'm shooting a Magnum.
I'll tell you this. Prior to working here,
Magnum.
I get it. I worked for a firearms manufacturer. Prior to working there, I worked for a gun shop. When I worked at that gun shop, we installed a lot of scopes. We made package like combos for the year, and whether that was like a varmint hunting combo, a deer hunting combo in either like a slug gun or a centerfire rifle, we were doing combos all the time. And then I was also mounting scopes for customers. And I put them on with a screwdriver and gusto. And over the years, customers would come back in the store and they'd be like, this thing doesn't shoot good, horribly inaccurate. The scope is junk, the gun is junk, the ammo's junk. And full admission, like I guess I had no idea which direction to go with it. Like, you'd just attack it from where you could. You'd change the scope out, or you'd change ammo, and you'd hope for some, visible success. Well, fast forward, when I got here to Vortex, like day 2, I learned that how I had been mounting rifle scopes prior to that was effectively completely wrong. They worked.
Right.
Yes. And this isn't to state that if you installed a rifle scope and you over-torqued it, it's in a state of failure. My inclination is that it will be eventually, but it might not be there right now. And I promise you, I have rifle scopes in my safe mounted guns that I mounted like 15 years ago that I haven't monkeyed with in a long time that are in a state of over-torque. Because at the time I was thinking, yeah, you got to put an elbow into it to make sure that they don't slide under recoil. And that's not untrue, but there is a torque range to target. And it should also be noted that really good rings will hold a rifle scope under the duress of even ferocious recoil if they're really good rings at moderate torque values. You don't have to go to the moon on the torque. There's a couple of designs out there that you will want to follow the recommended torque guidelines, and they are like sometimes grossly higher than what we recommend.
Interesting.
But that is more of a form factor to the ring and how they function. And of those that we've tested, like one of them calls out a 60 inch-pounds rating, which is wild. That ring is working at that torque load, and it works famously. And that's wonderful. But in short, if you have a good set of rings on that rifle and you are making sure that you have excellent surface contact between the mounting surface of the scope, like its main tube, and then the inner surfaces of the rings, 18 inch-pounds should hold up to just about everything. We'll fudge that line a little bit when we start looking at high thrust, high recoil systems and very heavy rifle scopes. And kind of a dirty secret, if we're looking at something like a Razor HD Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, where our tube wall thicknesses are pretty heavy and our weight is also pretty high, going to that 20 inch-pound mark is not going to make or break the situation. Like at that point in time, if you have a very high thrust firearm, and I'm talking like, lighter weight 300 Norma, 300 PRC, 338 Lapua, 408 Chi-Tech, 375 Chi-Tech, even some lighter weight 50 BMGs, going up a little bit on scopes like that is okay. But by and large, 15 to 18 inch-pounds with a quality set of rings, and you should expect no failure.
I go back in my memory banks too of scopes that I blamed as being junk before I got to Vortex. Rifles that just didn't shoot good. I threw a scope away one time. I'm like, dude, this thing doesn't even adjust. I'm like, yeah, I think that was probably...
Oh, it was me.
That was probably...
It was me. I had some sort of crisis in my head. Is that what they call an existential crisis? When you like sit back and you really think about things. Like as I'm learning This is like day 2, and I was listening to Scott Parks and Paul Neese talk. I realized like every hand load I threw that was not satisfactory, or at least what I was looking for, every rifle that I said, oh, these things are junk, or every optic that I said I was a lemon, there's a better than 75% certainty that was my fault.
Oh, the times that I spent at the range, and you get 2 to group here, and then you'd make an adjustment, and then it didn't move, adjustment didn't move, and then all of a sudden, boom! Oh, we got one over here. I'm like, what the heck is going on with this rifle system? It's like you said, either existential or like I looking back, it's like, kind of this like epiphany, like, oh, that's what that was.
It was me. Yeah. But
it's not you. It's me.
You and I both shoot higher recoiling rifles in some instances, and especially lighter weight, higher recoiling rifles. Your 300 short mag, for instance, that's not a heavy gun. Scoped, it's about 8 pounds. It's unbraked. It's got a lot of ferocity. Mark shoots it very well, by the way.
Thank you, Ryan.
17 inch pounds.
Case in point, with that exact firearm, Paul Neese and I were at the range. I can't remember what we were doing. Maybe I was just trying to get a 0 on that rifle. I had at the time, this is many years ago, I had a different set of rings. We might have not even been doing rings at the time, or it's just the ones that I had on that rifle. But I'm trying to get a 0, and I know the gun has shot this ammo before well. Yeah. And I'm like, and I'd print 2, and they'd be good, and then it'd be like, boom, 1 over here. I'm like, gosh, that's so weird. And then I'd make an adjustment and get it back in. I might do something correctly one time, and then boom. I'm burning through like 2 boxes of ammo with that 300 short, and it's just not pleasant to shoot. And I think Paul's rolling his eyes a little bit. And I'm like, Paul, I get that this is a high recoiling rifle, and it's, not the most, and it's not, I always talk about it, it's not the worst either. I mean, a lot of people would shoot this rifle just fine. They wouldn't pay any, never mind to the recoil. Like, it wouldn't cross their mind, right? So I don't want to be like, oh, I'm shooting, this beast. But I'm like, these shots are feeling good, and I think he's rolling his eyes a little bit. Eventually, we find out that part of the ring had sheared, and so I would shoot,
and it would shift,
and then it would shift.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I guess that's maybe not a myth or misconception, but a good note is if you are having something like that happen. Boy. Rings, bases, mounting, check those things, and action screws, stuff like that.
And if you're listening to this and you're not shooting a Vortex optic, consult that optic manufacturer as to what they recommend for ring torque. And you'll be surprised how much consistency there is within the optics industry. There's a few higher, lower, depending on kind of the optic itself. But for the most part, a lot of us are right in that same band. And because we've done a lot of testing collectively as independently, but collectively, to find that is what these things take to be held securely, but without undue force. Right.
Yep. What about, you got any more? I'm cranking them out off my list here.
I do want to go back to bigger's better. And you've got a couple that aren't slashed off there.
Well, I know. They're pretty complex, though.
Sure. One thing I hear a lot is I have older or aging eyes, and I need that magnification to see my target. And there is some truth in this. Like, you need a magnification factor that will allow you to, see what it is that we're trying to shoot, especially for small targets or something like this. But in general, the higher you go in magnification, the worse things get from an image perspective. And even if you had the greatest optical system in the world, anytime we go taller and taller and taller, we're diminishing the amount of light that can get through the system, so we're automatically making the image darker. We're narrowing our field of view. We're amplifying things like in-air distortion. So think mirage. If we've ever shot on a hot day and we turn that magnification way up, you'll start to exacerbate the prevalence of that mirage on the landscape.
Well, and you'll get that too, like, hey, your scope's, okay, here, maybe this is where you're going.
Yeah.
When I turn my magnification up, your scope gets blurry.
Sure. And what that is all of those things. We're diminishing the amount of light. We're narrowing the field of view. We're exacerbating the negative...
Like atmospheric conditions.
Correct,
Could be dust, could be
dust,
mirage.
pollen, smoke, mirage, any of that. And so there is a balance to be struck between, here again, optical quality and optical quantity. And I will generally try to reel people back from the big magnification is going to help me see better, and try to get them into a better optic. That is what actually helps you see better, size aside. If the image itself is not clear, brilliant, sharp, you can't see what it is if it's just magnified. Think about when like cell phones first had cameras on board and you take a picture of, something. And at the time you look at it and you're like, wow, that's really great. And then you compare that picture to a modern cell phone camera and it's like grainy and horrible.
Yes.
Right. This is a similar evolution in sport optics, right? So sport optics 40 years ago are not the same as they are today.
No.
And then magnification is like you take an image and then you start blowing it up. And instead of seeing, these beautiful lines and colors and shapes and contrast, we're seeing like pixelation. We're diminishing the resolution of that image by going bigger in magnification. And it can get to a point where it'll work against you. And that's where I say always consider optical quality first. If you're on the table between a high magnification factor rifle scope at a given price point, and then the next optical tier up, a lower magnification at a similar price point, I say it does you better, for most hunters anyway, to go with the lower magnification, higher optical quality system. From just an image perspective, you will have a better viewing experience out of that system.
Viewing experience,
Yep.
yes.
Yep.
But also, we're not necessarily considering the feature set.
Correct. And
that a person,
Yep.
That's going to hold weight if they're going to use those features.
Correct. Yep. And so there's exceptions to all of these, right?
Right.
So I'm not telling somebody to, go with a, Razor LHT 3-15 to shoot F-class when we have a Golden Eagle on the table. Like the Golden Eagle was optimized. Its feature sets are designed around F-class competition. It's the best tool for the job. I think the Golden Eagle would be, the Razor LHT would be putting you potentially at a deficit in the game when we're looking at what we need to do there. Optics aside, its feature set, and the Golden Eagle has a brilliant optical system, but its feature set is geared towards that. Just like I wouldn't tell somebody to necessarily hunt in, south central Wisconsin or northern Minnesota or northern Michigan with a 6-24 Diamondback Tactical, because that first focal plane reticle is going to be a little bit harder to see without any illumination assist at lower magnifications in the timber. It would be an inappropriate tool for the job.
Sure.
Yeah. Sure.
I think Mike McDowell might have written this one down. Usually I can't stump you. I don't know. All he wrote down was aperture myth.
Mike sometimes speaks in tongues and codes.
He does.
I wouldn't know where to start with that. If he just wrote aperture myth, we'd have to phone a friend on aperture myth.
Phone a friend, yeah. We'll just phone Mike. Maybe we'll do like another one where we follow up questions. Yeah. Questions for Mike.
Yeah.
Ryan, I'm looking at this rifle scope or binocular. How far can I see with it?
Oh yeah. Yep. That's a tough one. Magnification is not really a figure that you can use to judge how far something can shoot or how far you can see something, because that something could mean a lot of different things, right? So with an 8-power binocular, you can see a deer at several miles. What you can deduce about that subject that you're looking at, that's where the limitations of magnification come in. And then also, what can that optical system do? Like bring your eye and your brain information from downrange. And that's a tough one.
I mean, analogy, I can see the moon at night.
Yeah, definitely.
With my naked eye.
Yep.
There it is.
It's like 280,000 miles away.
Right. But I can see it differently through a spotting scope.
Correct. That is a tricky one. And so a lot of this comes down to personal preference too. Like Mark and I have different ideas on what the best binocular magnification is. Mark says 10x42. I think he's wrong. I think it's 8x42. We'll never get over this debate.
No.
We'll go to our graves with it. Here's a story. I was hunting mule deer in Wyoming a couple of years ago. And so I started my morning out glassing, and I'm watching deer kind of in this mountain meadow feeding. and they move up into curl leaf mountain mahogany and juniper and cedar and pine, and they go find like their first day beds. And so I'm picking apart the timber and the juniper and the mahogany, and I'm trying to find like a bedded deer or a deer that gets up and then sits back down, like readjusts. And I turn up a buck, and I'm like, oh, well, there's one. And I'm on an 8-power binocular mounted to a tripod. So I'm wonderfully stable. I'm well set, and I'm looking right at this thing. And I'm looking at the buck, and I'm like, okay, he's like a 2x2 probably, maybe a 3x3. He's well inside of his ears. So he's not a deer that I'm going to get up and take a walk for at this point in time. He's very thin. So it's obvious he's a pretty young deer. And so I grab my rangefinder, and I tag him. He's at 1,154 yards. Now, at 8 power, I'm able to deduce that he is a mule deer. He is thin. He is inside his ears. He's probably a 2 point, maybe a 3. I then pop off my binoculars and I slide my spotting scope into place on the tripod, and I start incrementally going up in magnification. And when I got to about 22, and then he kind of turned his head a little bit, I could definitively see that he was a 2x3, or at least the visible tines. Whether he had like a small brow on one side, maybe that would have made him something different, but like he stood out as that 2x3 at that point. So looking at that, okay, well, 8 power satiated my curiosity, I guess, if I'm unpacking that. I was able to tell he was not a deer that I was necessarily going to take a hike for at 1,154 yards. It wasn't until I got to like 22 power that I could really pin him down and tell you kind of what he was. I also think that that was about the threshold of distance in which I would be able to accurately resolve things like antler tines, like a count on them.
Yeah.
And I was still at a point in the day when the air was fairly clear, and it hadn't got too spooky with respect to mirage that would have just washed everything out. The further I would have extended that distance between me and subject, it would have been harder to deduce more information about his antler structure, for instance. Like going up to a 60 power spotting scope may not have made any difference whatsoever, and I may have found myself stuck on that probably 30 to 40 power range before I started losing things in that amplification of mirage. But the point is, it was long-winded, 8 power did a lot for me at 1,150 yards.
So then what do you like about that 8 power binocular versus the 10 that I would have as a minimum on my chest?
So field of view, there is a distinct advantage to the 8 in this case. Low light performance, there is a distinct advantage to the 8 in this case. And then inherent stability. And I don't know if that's a made up term or not, but if you're holding a binocular in your hands, and so I'm on a tripod and this is kind of eliminating this talking point, but if you're holding a binocular in your hands and you've got a natural tremor or a heartbeat or you're breathing heavy, every time you move, that movement is amplified, and exacerbated by that magnification factor, in that an 8 power binocular will appear steadier than a 12 power binocular, and a 12 will appear steadier than an 18. And aside from that, narrowing that field of view, it makes it harder for you to find something in your field of view, stay on that thing, and then the higher we go in magnification, I think the longer it takes my brain to register what it is that I'm looking at. So the more stable I can be, the better chance I have of seeing that thing. Now, and again, this is anecdotal. Here at Vortex, we've got this beautiful view in front of the shop, and we spend a lot of time looking out the windows and balconies through binoculars, either in testing or showing customers and things like this. And if I put an 8 and a 10 on a tripod and I take the wiggle factor out of it, and I put either myself or a customer behind it, and I start looking at pretty vast distances, I don't personally see a big enough advantage in the magnification factor of a 10 to outweigh the field of view advantage and the light advantage that an 8 brings me. In that, many times when I'm showing customers this and I say, tell me the difference between these two, a lot of times they don't see the magnification advantage. They do see the field of view advantage, and they do see this apparent brightness advantage. And they're like, well, they kind of look exactly the same, only this one's wider and brighter. And that's a really good way to look at it. When you get into 12s and 15s and 18s, that magnification advantage becomes far more apparent. Not without concession, though. Again, narrowing a field of view and then making a darker image and then making a shakier image if you're trying to handhold it. And that's why I pick 8s. Now, 10s are the universal binocular magnification, right? And I still think they're incredible. I don't run them because I run 8s and they give me everything that I want, plus a couple of little bonus features like that slightly wider field of view and slightly better lower light performance. So I pick 8s.
Very compelling.
You pick 10s because they're bigger.
I'm still going with the 10s.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad we got that covered. If your binocular has X glass.
Oh, sure.
That means it's good.
Yeah. So what Mark's talking about is like a brand or style of glass.
Yes.
Right. And that if a given optical system from any optical manufacturer didn't contain this, it would be an inferior product. And short answer is it's just not necessarily true.
Well, it's not hard and fast.
No. Certainly going with premium, like premium ingredients in your baking recipe is going to make a better pie, right? But there's a lot more to it than just the raw ingredients, right? It's what we call the optimization of an optical system, looking at it from front lens to back lens and everything in between, and then auditing what that optic needs to do. That if it's not executed correctly, and all we do is we just smash in the best of the best of the best, but there's a poor execution from the design standpoint, you don't end up with a brilliant optic. You might have an optic using, considerably lesser grades of material from like an optic standpoint that has been better optimized, that ends up being the better optical solution. So it's not so straightforward in that this style of glass or this prism or what have you is going to guarantee an optic from brand X, Y, or Z is better.
Right. And like you said, it's not straightforward. In some ways it's not true, but it's also not untrue.
Correct.
I'd say oftentimes, like if maybe you looked through an optic and it had, we'll say X class, whatever X class is, that's deemed X class. Well, part of the reason why that X class looks so darn good is because that optic has a lot of those things that you were just talking about with the optical design. It's a very well executed optic.
Yes.
Overall.
Yes.
Taking everything into consideration.
And that's extremely important to the overall viewing success with that optic. That optimization is just pivotal in making sure that the viewing experience is outstanding. And then the performance features that we're looking for in an optic are up to par. That's a good question. I hear that one less and less now.
Yeah, it was really hot.
Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I don't know why that kind of spiked and then kind of then all of a sudden it just became less important.
Well, I think to give...
Not less important, but just like you said, just doesn't come up as much.
I think if I was to try to strike out and find a reason for that, I mean, it could be stated that, say, 24 years ago or so, when there was not as many optics manufacturers out there and we didn't have like these computer-aided drafting and design programs and the crazy manufacturing processes that are afforded to a modern manufacturer, that may have been the differentiator between a really good scope and an okay scope, right? Was just simply the ingredients. If everybody was, kind of doing things the same from a design standpoint and the differentiator was just raw optical quality, then it stands to reason that the one with better optical qualities from an element standpoint is going to provide a better image, right? Modern manufacturing is an incredible thing. We have the best scopes we've ever had in the history of telescopic rifle scopes as an industry. We've got the best cars we've ever had. And, well, Jimmy will probably...
He would disagree with you 100% there.
He would. I'm surprised he likes blinkers that aren't like candle powered or something. He just likes everything so analog. But that was a bad analogy. It's the best it's ever been. We're in the peak of our performance from a manufacturing capability standpoint, and by optimizing that now, perhaps we don't have to put so much focus on a particular style of glass, and you can actually achieve what 20 years ago that style of glass was renowned for using different materials or different manufacturing processes and practices and end up with an equivalent or potentially even better product for certain.
That makes sense.
Yes.
We've exhausted my list. It's tapped out.
Okay. I'm still on bigger is not always better.
But it sometimes is.
Sometimes. It depends.
You love hunting with a 2.5 to 10.
I'm crazy about modesty in optics. I run an 8x42, an 11 to 33, and a 2.5 to 10 for just about everything.
I run a 3 to... not all the time, by any means, because I run a lot of different things a lot of the time. I'd say, in general,
Yep.
I'm running a 10x42 or 10x50 binocular, but oftentimes a 12x50. A 3 to 15 rifle scope, which, when I look at that compared to a 2.5 to 10, the low end is only 0.5 power. But then I get 5 more power on the top end. And I like to maximize my effective range, and I feel like more magnification helps me be more precise at distance. And I generally run a 65 millimeter spotting scope, which isn't the big dog.
No.
It's actually a step down.
No.
But I value the low end in that spotting scope as well.
Sure.
As the high
Sure.
end. So.
I guess I make my decisions in the equipment based on where I found myself using it the most. So spotting scopes in particular, I was very frustrated for many years with spotting scopes because I started with this huge Hubble telescope of a spotting scope when I started hunting the West, when I knew nothing about nothing and nothing about anything. And I immediately after the first hunt I ever went on, I was like, this thing is a hunk of junk. And I upgraded to, it was almost double the price, very similar capability from like a magnification perspective, but definitely better optical system. And I was happier with it. But something that my hunting partner and I especially noticed was we were hauling around these big optics, huge optics, and we were cutting the magnification down considerably. And this was with respect to spotting scopes. In order to get a usable image. And by that, I mean like throughout the diverse amount of light conditions that you'd have during a given day, right? So you have early morning, late morning, midday, late afternoon, early evening, right? And when we're looking at the huge picture of use in that time frame, as we were in the waning hours of the morning or in the early hours of the evening, we're running the spotting scopes on lower magnification because we need to allow light in there so that we can see better. When we get to the midday, now the mirage is up, we got to cut that magnification back a little bit in order to get through the mirage. And then as we get closer to evening, we're dialing back down again in order to, increase the amount of light that's coming through there. My question to myself was, with my style of hunting, why am I carrying around a heavy spotting scope that I'm cutting back considerably? I'm not winning anything by having that extra top end, except for a very few select periods of time during the day. And
which it can be extremely handy and crucial. I'm not saying your spot. So I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, but
it doesn't discount the merit of, like you take, like the Razor HD series. You got the 50 millimeter, the 65, the 85.
Yep.
Sometimes the 85 has a top end of 60. There are definitely times where that 60 power is going to possibly be a difference maker for you.
I haven't personally found it yet in any of the hunts that I've done.
Right.
But
I'd say in general, though, where I agree with you, I guess what I don't want to say is you don't need one of those. And not just to say that you don't need it because we make it. But, there's certain people, certain hunts that is going to be 10,000% the choice.
Certainly.
For most of the stuff that I do, I probably, spend a lot of time between 20 and 40.
Sure. And for what I was after, when I got introduced to the 11 to 33, that thing's a toy. It's not a real spotting scope. And then I looked through it, and I was like, oh, my gosh. And I haven't deviated since. I have two 65 millimeter razors. I use them on the range. I especially like my 22 to 48 with the fixed eyepiece, with the long eye relief eyepiece. And I love using them at night when I'm looking at the moon or I'm looking at Saturn or Jupiter or stars, comets, etc. Oh gosh, amazing. But I don't bring them into the field anymore because they're not providing me with anything that my 11 to 33 won't.
Is that when you bring your guitar and write poetry?
Kind of. That was a slight, Mark.
I know. Why would I do that?
That was a slight because we're arguing about what is the better optical system.
I felt threatened, and it was a cheap shot.
It wasn't supposed to be a threat. I do say that I think that larger magnification spotting scopes are exceptionally well versed at looking at very finite details at relatively close distances. Once we start adding a ton of atmosphere between observation device and subject, it goes out the window because now we have to contend with mirage, we have to contend with light, and it's almost a nearly impossible thing to overcome without backing that magnification down and getting away from the mirage and giving yourself a little bit more light through the system. And I haven't encountered the situation in which, with my 11 to 33 anyways, where I've turned it up to 33 and be like, man, I wish I had 48.
Couldn't tell what you needed to tell.
No.
Yeah. We've mentioned this a million times, but I think it bears repeating, and it kind of goes into, we're talking about spotting scopes and binoculars, and I'd say oftentimes we get the call or the question via social media or somebody writes in, I'm going out west, what spotting scope should I get?
Yeah.
And I think there's a misconception, while we're on misconceptions, that a person, when you go out west, you're basically going to be spending all your time behind a spotting scope versus binoculars.
No.
And I guess my question would be, or my response would be, and I think yours might be similar, I guess my response would first be, what binocular do you have?
Yeah. Yep.
And then if it was, I don't have a binocular, or I've got a binocular and maybe it's just, maybe not the best, I'd say take that spotting scope money and invest in a good binocular.
Yes.
Bring a spotting scope next year.
Yep. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like, if I were to condense the amount of time that I look, and I've done this before actually, the amount of time that I look through a given optical system on a hunt, 90% of that time is going to be consumed by the binocular. In the style of hunting that I do now, and speaking specifically west, right? Because that's where we probably find ourselves with a binocular, with a spotting scope in tandem. And the spotting scope for me is an extremely useful tool. This is also another reason why I run the 11 to 33 over anything else. When I can't pull the level of detail that my binocular can give me for positive confirmation on a target or subject that I'm looking at, that's when the spotting scope comes out.
So it doesn't change the critical nature of the spotting scope because it's incredibly critical.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But
the amount of detail that I can pull, especially with a tripod stabilized binocular, is amazing. When you look at especially deer, I don't hunt elk, so I can't speak to elk. Deer and pronghorn. When you look at a slammer mule deer or a slammer whitetail or a slammer pronghorn at 8, 10, or 12x, you can generally be like, whoa, oh, he's worth the walk. The spotting scope is for those instances where there's possibly obscuration to the target, like he's in the brush, he's bedded, so it's a weird shadow situation. You really need to pick out those super finite things to be like, is that a giant drop tine or is that a piece of sage? The spotting scope can tell you that.
It can. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I've spent like minutes convinced through my binoculars, that's got to be, like, a bear. I know I'm looking at part of a bear, or I know I'm looking at part of a deer, and then and again, this is just like part of it, but the coloration and the shape and the way whatever the shadows hit it, and you just boring a hole in it, waiting for it to move, and then finally you get the spotting scope out. You're like, son of a bee sting. It is a stump.
Yeah. I've looked at groups of does that turned into bachelor bucks. You're like, yeah, it's just a couple of does out there, and then also you throw up the old spotter, and you're like, oh no, he's actually a decent 4-point.
Gosh, that happened. That happened to me in Wisconsin one time.
Yeah.
I was what you think? Oh, Wisconsin, you're not hunting, shooting that far, and I wasn't looking that far. Yeah. It was early morning, and it was just breaking daylight, opening day of rifle season, and this deer's out in some cut corn. and I'm like, oh, cool, there's a deer out there. And I'm looking at it with my naked eye, and it's actually like, it's shooting light, but like just probably, I mean, we've just broken into shooting light. And it's walking around doing deer things out there, and I'm like, I'm like, it's a doe. Like, with my naked eye, I'm like, it's a doe. And then I'm like, I should look at that with a set of binoculars. Dude, I'm like, oh, God, that's a buck. I'm like, oh, that's a buck that I should shoot.
Yeah.
And it was a really nice buck, but the antlers were, I mean, you know what generally a whitetail buck antlers look like.
Yep.
And against that cut corn.
Yep. The right backdrop, lost.
Invisible.
Yep.
And then I put the binos up, and I mean, those binos, who knows what could happen? Somebody shoots, or the deer just walks back in the trees because it's opening day of rifle season. They probably shouldn't be standing out in the open.
Right. They didn't get the memo.
Binoculars got me that buck.
Yeah, I've been there.
So anyway, I don't know why. I don't know how you caused me to sidetrack into that story, but
the importance of spotting scopes or binoculars.
Yeah.
The magnification assist. And I don't want to think, if people are listening, that I think Mark is wrong in running a 22 to 48 by 65, and I'm right in running 11 to 33. Mark will also hold an advantage of, he doesn't have to use the top end of the magnification range in the spotting scope. He can certainly dial it back. Mm-hmm. And then he can further appreciate the optical system that is advantage that a 65 would offer over a 50. Right. Then you'd hold an advantage. You do so at the penalty of form factor and weight. So you have a larger spotting scope, you have a heavier spotting scope. Mm-hmm. Right? So concessions that I make based on expectations that I have, which turn the clock back like 15, 16 years when I started doing this, my expectation was way different with spotting scopes than what I think reality is. And now I've learned to kind of tailor that expectation a little bit and then use the tool as it's supposed to be used. Same thing with binoculars. And I was that guy that you mentioned when I got on board with this first hunt that I did. I was like, oh, I got to have a spotting scope. Like, I won't be able to do anything because I thought we were going to just spend 5 hours a day behind a spotting scope.
So, and I guess I'll caveat myself though, Ryan. I know folks that they are extremely good hunters and they live behind their spotters.
Yeah.
So,
would you say that is the majority of it, or that is a specific instance?
For some, the majority of people, or I think it depends on.
I want you to go coast to coast, region to region, species to species, and if you were to start tailing, like, what is the preferential and probably the most conducive for success style of hunting? Is it buried in your spotting scope, or is it behind your binos until you locate something that you need a better pick on and grab your spotter?
I mean, so yes, I would say the latter.
Yeah.
Binos to spotter. I mean, and that's how I hunt.
Yeah.
I'd say 99% of the time. Really, you know what I mean?
Yep.
I just know folks that are just really successful hunters, and they live in open landscapes where they're really picking apart country at extreme distances. Probably longer distances than maybe I sometimes like think to be looking. Sure. In a way.
Like
I don't know.
Glassing out huge drainages or
mountains that are a day away type stuff, and like, oh, maybe we'll get over there in a couple days.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a way around that we can get to that.
If you dialed back to 20, you wouldn't be at a field of view disadvantage because you'd be capturing massive swaths.
You're still
of land.
looking at a lot.
Right. Correct.
So the answer, it depends.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. Okay. I have a couple.
Oh, all right.
Okay. Mills versus MOA.
Okay.
One is better than the other.
Right.
I disagree. I think that here again, it depends. So the title of this podcast would be like Optics Misconceptions, it depends.
Right.
But Mills versus MOA, these two angular units of adjustment, which we've talked about quite a bit. There's no inches, there's no feet, there's no yards, parsecs, light years. This is an angular unit of measurement. They do exactly the same thing for the shooter. They provide us, we'll call it a coordinate, to dial to or hold at to put a bullet on target. I don't think one carries any inherent advantage with a broad stroke statement.
Okay.
I think that application is everything. And if my preference is if I'm running like a technical or tactical style optic, think PST Gen 2, Strike Eagle 5-25 or 3-18, Venom 5-25, Razor Gen 3 6-36, where I'm twisting turrets and I'm holding off using a reticle. I prefer the MRAD format.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reticle...
Well, we should throw the LHT in there as well.
I shoot an MRAD LHT.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I shoot 2 of them. If I have to hold off on a reticle, or if I have to manipulate a turret with time constraint being a factor, I like MRAD, generally speaking, because the numbers are smaller. Mm-hmm. I can visually dissect the reticle quicker, and I'm usually working in smaller increment, right?
Like, what do you mean by smaller increment?
So if we're looking at the reticle on a lot of MRAD scopes, you're seeing a subtension line at every 0.5 MRAD. On a lot of MOA scopes, it's 1 or even 2 MOA per subtension line. So if I need to find the spaces between the spaces, I'm holding somewhat ambiguously on an MOA scope, and I'm taking I'm having to like visually dissect that reticle not once, not twice, but maybe 3 or even 4 times, depending on the resolution on the scale on the reticle. If it's like a 2 MOA subtension width. Mm-hmm. With an MRAD scope, if I'm working in 0.5s, that's usually a little bit easier to get into. Like if I need to find 5.25, I need to make 1 visual bisection.
Sure.
Yeah. Instead of 3 or 4 on an MOA optic. With respect to the turrets, like on a lot of our scopes, you're gonna see a turret density of like 10 mils per revolution on some of these tactical scopes. 10 mils, it's a pretty coarse adjustment screw on that rifle scope. That brings me on a lot of modern centerfire rifle cartridges to like 1,000 yards and sometimes even a little bit beyond.
Right.
So I can cover the broad swath of any engagement that I would have with a revolution or less on the turret. With an MOA scope, most of these are 25 MOA per revolution on the tall scopes. And depending on that cartridge, I might have a revolution plus change to get to that distance. The more I have to manage that turret in revolutions, and the larger the figure is, like to read the number 34 is more difficult for my caveman brain than to read the number 10. So I gravitate towards MRAD because it's just easier for me to unpack.
You only have 10 fingers.
Correct.
So
exactly correct. And then memorizing my dope for me has been easier in MRAD. Now,
why do you say that?
Just because the numbers are smaller.
Okay, just the same.
Yep. I'm correlating a distance to a number that is smaller. I'm not having to remember 23.75, was it? 25.75? Something like that. Mm-hmm. I'm remembering like 6.
Yeah.
Gets me into the ballpark.
Well, and then also, 6.1,
yep.
6.2. Those, graduations are intense, or
yep.
the clicks are intense.
Yep.
Which for me is easier now. I remember for some reason, and to me it's interesting how difficult the switch can be mentally when you're used to one system or the other.
Yeah.
But then once you do it, but then also, I always think of it, people say, well, which one do I want, this or this? And sometimes my answer is, well, what do all the other scopes in your safe click in?
Yep.
And then, the other answer is, at the end of the day, it's somewhat inconsequential. Like
Correct.
you said, there's definitely some things and some compelling things that you said right there,
yep.
and that I agree with. But at the end of the day, you are turning to a number.
Yep. Or holding to a line.
Or holding to a line, so
yep.
whatever that number is,
Yep.
But I find myself in scopes that I'm going to dial now. I edge towards mils these days. For the same reasons that you mentioned.
When I had first, I think, seriously started shooting technical rifle scopes, the shooters I was with, some of them were military or prior law enforcement, or circle was a vast array of experience levels. I said, well, what should I get? And they said, get mils. And I said, why? And they said, because. And so I did.
Because mils are tactical.
Well, and so part of it, I think, was that. There was some association with the word being somehow more adept and tactical or whatever. Now, having learned and am versed in both, I still definitely do prefer MRAD for that style of optic. Now, I'm going to counter that, and if you told me you wanted to shoot bench rest competition, or you wanted to shoot like F-class competition.
Okay.
And
I see where you're going here.
And we had an extraordinary precedence on placing the bullet at the exact point that it needed to be. I'm going to yield to MOA because now I talked about the coarseness in that adjustment, like how much we're moving with a given click or a revolution. The MOA turret is moving us smaller increments. If we're going to transfer that angular value to a linear value, we're seeing a shorter movement with MOA. So case in point, our Golden Eagle that has a 1/8 MOA per click system.
An even finer click value because of application.
Yep. So if the difference at 1,000 yards between one click is one side of the X-ring or the other in, say, an MRAD system, well, that's not great. But if we can go from one side of the X-ring to the X with an 1/8 MOA system, that's where the advantage is held. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with shooting like bench rest competition or IR-50 rimfire competition, where we need to land extraordinarily precisely on a very specific spot. Going with the adjustment system that has the, what do you want to call it, the finest degree of resolution per click is the advantage. Mm-hmm. And then usually you're not seeing a very busy reticle with these, right? Mm-hmm. We're usually shooting at fixed distances, like fixed or assigned distances like 600 or 1,000
with something yards. Like the Golden Eagle.
Yeah. And we now don't need a reticle
which
that
is a 15 to 60 magnification.
Yeah.
Very application specific rifle scope.
Yep. That's where that tool is absolutely perfect. And then if I look at the majority of my hunting optics, as much as my preference is to MRAD, like 90% of them are MOA. And that's what that optical system or mechanical system comes in. So simple.
I was going to say, for so long, that was is the standard.
Yeah, absolutely.
For that style of optic. And, and I guess I could see where, I was kind of like saying it just like, well, because, mills are tactical. But you see mills and MOA in a quotation mark tactical scope or with more features, purpose built for dialing, things like that. You don't see the inverse of that or the reverse of that. You don't see mill-based scopes in your 3 to 9 by 40.
No. And so because that's how those systems are built and what they're really optimized for, it works famously. And when I'm looking at like a BDC turret, I'm assigning a yardage value to a given line. I'm not using the reticle for milling per se, like we would with a scale reticle, like a EBR 2C or an EBR 7 or whatever. I've got a yardage that's associated with that line, and that's the line that I'm holding to. And they come in conventions, dictates that they come generally in MOA, and I'm happy as a clam to use them. And it doesn't really bother me in the least. No. Yeah. How about mounting heights? This is a tricky one because I have to talk out of both sides of my mouth.
Yes.
Getting the scope lower to your gun means it's more accurate. I've heard that as long as I've been in the industry. Like, the lower you can mount that scope to that gun, the better it's going to shoot. It's just simply not true.
Okay, but I'll say this. For me, I generally shoot a gun, like, I guess, okay, well, again, it depends. But like if it's like a sporter style bolt action rifle for hunting, I like that scope low.
Sure. And that's a fitment thing.
Yes.
And so it doesn't add some sort of advantage to accuracy, more so than it lends useful for form factor, for fit, recoil mitigation, indexing on your cheek weld or on your comb on your rifle, that kind of thing. So what I will say is, depending on your rifle's configuration, because I'll throw this lower is better out the window when I mention the words AR-15, AR-15 or AR-10, a lot of chassis type rifles where, like, from a geometry standpoint, you're not able to mount the scope low. Or if you could, it'd be very difficult to get behind the gun.
Yeah, it would be like
the
reverse of what I was talking about.
Correct.
You'd be doing it for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, and as Mark stated, on the sporter style rifles, I'll pick a Tikka T3, for instance. I shoot a lot of Tikkas. You might not know that.
I'm aware. Actually, you mention it daily.
I cannot get my scope rings low enough.
Mm-hmm. Within reason.
Yeah.
Within reason.
When I get behind that gun, I still have a cheek weld discrepancy that I have to address with a cheek riser of some kind. Or I have to say I'm okay with lifting my head up just a little bit. Your facial features are going to dictate success or failure there as much as your rifle is going to dictate success or failure. What should be stated is ring height when we're taking into consideration the form factor of the rifle and then the shooter's body type will dictate success or failure. Not that one is necessarily better than the other.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then also, if you're looking to get a scope mounted up and somebody's doing this for you, make sure that you're involved in the process. Your scope should fit you like your shoes. Just as we would expect our archery equipment, your draw length to be set for you, your anchor points with respect to your...
That's a good analogy.
Yes. As much consideration as I see folks put into their archery equipment, and especially with draw length, and especially with anchor points, and especially with like kisser buttons or nose buttons.
Yeah, you wouldn't drop your bow off and say, set this up, I'll be back to pick it up, and then just go home and start shooting.
Correct. When we have folks come into the shop here and we're setting rifle scopes up for them, that person is intimately involved in the process. Like we are setting that optic up to fit that shooter, and that is paramount to success, truly. So as much consideration as you would with your bow, do it with your rifle too. Make sure that your ring or your optic placement within the rings with respect to placement on top of the receiver, fore and aft, with respect to your length of pull, cheek weld, all of that's taken into consideration, and it will pay you dividends when you're on the bench and in the field. So that's a big one.
That's a true story.
I want to talk about illumination.
Golly, you're just kind of, I was getting ready to wind down. You're stepping on the gas. Let's go.
I don't want to poo-poo illumination because I think it's useful sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a lot of people who will opt out of a rifle scope because it doesn't have an illuminated reticle, thinking that it will not work for them in the first hours of the morning or the latest hours of the evening. And I think that it certainly can be useful for giving you reticle visibility, especially if we're looking at a dark target and dark background. Be careful with illumination, though, so that you don't run it too high. And don't look at an illumination component that's astoundingly bright as better than one that is matched for that light condition. So if you take a look at like a Razor LHT, I think the illumination system on there is brilliant with respect to its top end and bottom end. It's not a screaming bright red dot. There's a time and a place for that, and I don't think it's in a hunting optic.
Right. I mean, what you might hear, like in a tactical optic or something like that, like does it have daylight bright illumination?
Yep.
Could be. I mean, could be extremely important. Could be the deal breaker.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
The only time you really need illumination in a hunting optic is in your lowest light scenarios, where also that's also not when you need the most illumination.
Yep.
You're using
you have just enough
on one of the lower settings of illumination in those low light scenarios.
Yep.
Where I find illumination, so the scopes that I've used mostly with illumination are the LHT 3 to 15 and the LHT 4.5 to 22.
Sure.
Now, the only time I really use the illumination in the 3 to 15, which has that, I think it's a quarter MOA center dot.
Yep, very small, fine, precise.
Open center.
Yep.
I love that reticle, man. You just feel like you can just pin that thing. It's like, oh boy, it's go time. Was bear hunting, low light situations, black object in low light.
Yep.
And just trying to create a little bit of contrast so I could, gain that aim. And I could actually see the dot, but it did help, right?
Oh, yes.
And then with the 4.5 to 22, which is first focal plane, which I really like that it goes to 4.5 to 22, because as we talked, I like magnification when I'm going to execute longer range shots. But if I'm hunting in the timber or something like that, I have the magnification cranked down, and then I'll engage the illumination then And that'll create the contrast that I need, because as I go down in magnification in the first focal plane, that reticle does get smaller.
Yep.
So,
which brings me to my final talking point. Focal plane. I have a lot of people calling up, especially newer shooters in the past couple of years when we added a whole bunch of new hunters and shooters to the landscape. First focal plane is better, or second focal plane is better. And it depends.
I was going to say, and it goes back to our final answer of that depends.
Yeah. There's a time and a place for both. And you couldn't, or at least I can't, generally say that one is better than the other. I can look at the merits of first focal plane, and I don't see a lot of penalty because it affords the shooter a lot of, we'll call it security. Like, you don't have to worry about what magnification you're on if you're going to hold off your reticle, right?
Also ask yourself the question, how often are you going to hold off your reticle?
Right.
It could be a lot.
It could be. It could be. And I have counters to all of that. But understand that a first focal plane rifle scope, as Mark had alluded to, like when he's hunting in timber with a 4.5 to 22, he's in a tall magnification range. This is where it's like, hey, I think it's a safer thing to do a first focal plane with that tall a magnification range. Because if you're not on your subtension magnification of your second focal plane rifle scope that's tall in magnification, and you do have to shoot off your reticle, you can miss. And I've seen it. I've done it. First focal plane negates that. Okay? In case Mark has a 4.5 to 22, if he's on 12, he can hold off his reticle and hammer. No sweat. Understand, though, that with first focal plane, that reticle will appear to shrink as you demagnify. What's actually happening is it's staying the same relative to the target while magnification decreases. It makes the reticle harder to see with a lot of visual like obscuration or obstruction in the background. Mm-hmm. So it might not be the best choice for the shooter who's going to be hunting a heavily timbered area unless it's illuminated. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's probably a better case to make for a second focal plane, modest magnified rifle scope at that point. You have a very visible reticle. And then I say, okay, if we're going to be shooting closer distances where we don't have a precedence for subtension magnification maintenance, we don't need to worry about that so much because we might not be approaching a distance in which I have to worry about trajectory. The boldness of a second focal plane rifle scope will definitely be a tactical advantage.
Oh, 100%.
In this case. I would say, though, if you're the shooter who's going to be shooting a competition where you're like PRS or NRL, where you're across the course and you'll want to be on varying magnifications depending on the target presentation or depending on an objective. If you have to mill a target or make a wind call, you could be all over the board with magnification. First focal plane all the way.
Right.
Like, no question about it.
Right.
But one is not, I don't think, inherently better than the other across the board.
No.
It just depends.
I mean, it goes, how are you going to use it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow, Ryan.
I think I'm good. I don't know. I think I'm good.
I think I'm good too. Hopefully, folks out there are good. And maybe we've, cleared a few things up. That's a little optics pun there. Yeah.
You still got it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to point out, and Mark, thank you. I brought the most obnoxious cup I could find.
Yeah.
To this podcast, and you did not yell at me for having.
I'm just glad it's not mine.
It even says my name on it.
Oh, it is yours. Yeah, that's 100% yours. Yeah, it does have your name on it.
That's a big orange cup.
You're not going to lose it.
Nope. Hopefully not.
Blaze orange. Where'd you get this blaze orange cup? A
customer sent that in. He's got a Cerakoting and laser engraving operation. Isn't that cool?
I like it.
Yep. Holds a lot of coffee, too. I like that.
That's important. That's an important feature.
Yep.
Cool, man. All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for listening. Like I said, hopefully that clears things up.
Yep.
We'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.